Hello and welcome to this trip plan presentation about backpacking in the Mount Prindle area. This trip plan will include logistics about getting out there and where to park and that kind of thing. It'll include maps. There'll be gear lists for this particular trip. There'll be some good camping options based on where you want to go, how far out you want to go, and I'll also talk about a few of the risks associated with this trip. To start with, this trip is about the Mount Prindle area, which is located out the Steese Highway in the White Mountains Recreation Area. To get out there, you take the Steese Highway out of Fox and head out at mile 57 on your left-hand side heading out. U.S. Creek Road will be there. Head up and over the U.S. Creek Road. After about 7 miles, you'll cross the Nome Creek Bridge and you'll come to a T intersection. There you take a right, and 4 more miles out this road will get you to the Mount Prindle campground. This is where you'll park. There's an outhouse there, and from there you leave the little parking area next to the outhouse and you don't travel very far. Maybe there's a little social trail about 40 feet to a decent crossing. There's another one a bit further up, but make your way across that branch of Nome Creek and then follow that for about 200 feet and you'll come to another place where the social trail crosses the little creek coming in from your right. Both creeks will probably require wet feet, so be aware. They're slippery rocks, and the depth of those creeks can vary quite a bit based on the season. After you've crossed that second creek, there's a really obvious social trail that heads up the valley. It's pretty well used by day users, but it also will be your route for heading up the valley towards the ridge line. So after following this trail, it starts to peter out and the valley widens out and opens up into a bowl with a ridge at the head of the valley. And so after about 5 miles in, this will be one of your potential camp areas. So I've divided this backpacking route into 3 different stages. The first stage is in the valley, and it doesn't involve a huge amount of elevation. The second stage is climbing up onto the ridge above the Nome Creek Valley. This is where you get into that open terrain with the big tours all over the ridge, and continuing out that ridge to the summit of Mount Prindle proper, which is the highest point in the White Mountains Rec area. And then the other portion is if you decide to descend into the valley on the backside, where there's a 900-foot granite wall that's very impressive and has beautiful areas to camp below it. This is a picture of the upper Nome Creek Valley. This is going to be kind of the area where your first potential campsite could be 5 miles in, a nice reasonable distance. It's also your last easy access to water until you get all the way up and over the summit of Mount Prindle and down into the valley with the rock wall. Depending on, there could be snowfields, little creeks and things, but overall this is where you're going to want to stock up on water for that portion of the hike or backpacking trip. So I mentioned some different camping options. So to start with, this area that we're in that picture at the head of Nome Creek is a good area to think about. If you want to be up amongst the tours on the ridge line, it's another about 1.5 miles to get kind of up to some nice flat areas in between some of those tours. It also involves a reasonably significant climb of about 800 vertical feet, picking your way up. There's no distinct trail at this point, so it's kind of a choose your own adventure, follow the path of least resistance area to hike through. And then that area up on the ridge, as I mentioned before, may not have water easily accessible, but provides a more scenic location for that vistas and whatnot in a camping area. This is a picture of the southeast buttress of Mount Prindle, and you can see just the huge nature of the rock wall, something we don't get a ton in the interior, so it's something unique and beautiful. If you choose, people hike all the way from the Mount Prindle campground into the base of the rock face as well in one day. Just be prepared for a long day if you decide that's the route you want to go. And so breaking it up into 2 nights is sometimes a nice thing, just to not have quite as epic of a day getting in here. So you can see that in this slide that as you get from the summit of Mount Prindle down to the base of the rock face, it's about a 2,000-foot descent. So it's definitely drops you down quite a bit, which means, of course, you have to go back up that descent. Like I said, you could do this entire trip in one day. It's from the campground, it's about 9 miles in, about 3,600 feet of vertical gain, and about 2,700 feet of vertical descent. So again, it's a fairly long day if you choose to do that. One thing a lot of people would do after they've gotten into that face of that down below that campground at the base of the rocks would then be to hike all the way out to the campground in one day. This out is easier. As you can see, there's more descent than ascent, and heading down that ridge and down that Nome Creek Valley back to the car is feasible for many folks. This is a picture of the ridge line. It gives you sort of a feel for what a lot of the hiking is like. You've got some rock areas to cross, but overall the hiking is pretty open and fairly good hiking. One thing to be aware of is the season in which you travel. Probably early June is the earliest most people would want to travel through this high country. You can see this is a picture from early June, and you can see still a significant number of snow patches around, which would make some of these ascents and descents quite a bit more sketchy without mountain axes and crampons and that kind of equipment. And the snow in May would also have a high propensity for post-holing through snow and whatnot. So something to consider. And hiking out here can be good and beautiful into certainly into mid-September as far as the time frame goes. Obviously, we've got some variables starting that time of year for the new snow for the winter coming. This is a close-up topo map of basically from the head of Nome Creek to the summit of Mount Prindle. One thing, these maps, the PDFs of these maps are available. The link to a Google Drive is at the end of this presentation, so that you can have hard copies of these maps. This is a close-up map of the descent from the summit of Mount Prindle into the base of the rock wall. You can see at the base of the rock wall those really tight contour lines there, which denote that large cliff face that exists there. Across that fork of American Creek from the rock wall is another rock wall called the 400-foot wall that lies right along that broad ridge that comes off the summit of Mount Prindle. And again, that provides a really scenic place to camp as well, if you're not interested in dropping that extra bit into that and camping truly below that rock face. This is a general list of some group gear that I would take on a trip like this. Overall, it covers most of your basics: shelter, including sleeping bag and whatnot, wildlife safety in terms of bear barrels and bear spray. Obviously, bear safe practices in camp are going to be important as well. Communication devices, first aid kits, toilet kits, and then a way to purify your water, something like a SteriPen or some chlorine tabs or a water filter. And this just gives you a feel for some of the gear necessary for a trip like this. This is a list of some of the personal gear that everyone should have. The weather out here can sometimes be epic. The mosquitoes can certainly be epic. So some of the important things are clothes that deal well with moisture, quick drying, good rain gear, and then whatever system you use for mosquitoes. I personally like to wear thin clothing that mosquitoes can't bite through, long sleeve tops and bottoms, even when it's fairly warm, and have the option of a head net if the mosquitoes are at that level. So I use more a covering system than necessarily a chemical like a DEET or something like that. But having whatever option you're most comfortable with is important for this. This picture is representative of the walking on the ridge, both heading up to the summit of Mount Prindle and coming back down. Rocky tours, but overall pretty good smooth walking. One thing that I find really helpful for this terrain is trekking poles, just to make me more of a four-legged creature and give me some extra balance and support for walking across this uneven terrain. So as with all trips, getting out, there are risks associated with this. The first risk I'm going to talk about is wildlife. So we're out in the wilderness, so certainly wildlife can be a potential risk. This could mean bears, this could mean moose, certainly in the valleys more especially. As you get up onto the ridges, your view increases significantly, which really can help with the reduction of some of the risks with wildlife so that you can be aware of them and stay away from them. Even sheep in this area, there tend to be a lot of sheep, can get into your stuff at camp. You have to be a little aware because they might be wandering right into your camp up on those ridge lines. Mountain weather is huge out here. The weather can be epic, both in terms of rain, in terms of wind, and the clouds definitely drop down and put you into a fog where navigation and staying with your group can be a concern. So you need to be prepared for those changes in weather and be watching that, maybe choosing your trip based on forecasted weather and whatnot. Slip, trips, and falls are big out here. Obviously, it's loose, rocky terrain. You're not on a trail per se for most of the hiking, and so you need to be very aware of your walking. Make sure your shoes have good tread on them. Maybe think about those trekking poles as far as that goes. There are some stream crossings, especially at the beginning, and potentially right before you get to the rock face at on that fork of the American Fork. So being aware of like water levels, traction, things like that are really important. Most of the creeks are fairly benign, but if they're at flood level, any of the creeks could potentially be dangerous. And finally, technical scrambling. Anytime you get all these beautiful rock formations, tours, and rock walls for that matter, it's tempting to want to scramble around and climb up stuff. You need to be aware that the rock has a lot of lichen on it, can be quite slippery, and chunks definitely come off. The other thing that gets people in trouble is it's a lot easier to climb up than climb down, and so people get up something and then realize they turn around and that they are having difficulty getting down. It's such an isolated location that the consequence of even a small fall could be greatly increased just because it's really hard to get into this area. This is a vista from near the summit of Mount Prindle looking down towards the large rock faces that exist down there. The broad ridge kind of on the right-hand side of the screen is what you'd walk down to get into that area. If you're looking for some additional resources, like I said, this link below is a link to the Google Drive that'll have the 3 maps in this presentation, the 2 gear lists, and this presentation itself, without the audio, of course, and for you to look at and reference in the future. It's a great idea if you're heading out there to have some extra navigation help besides just a map and compass. I really like the Guide GPS app, and it makes sense to download both this route and the topo maps and maybe the Google image maps directly onto your phone before you get out there, so you have those available for reference as things maybe get you a little turned around in the fog or whatnot in this location. If you end up having any questions and comments about this presentation, please contact the Outdoor Adventure Office at UAF. Thank you very much, and hopefully you enjoy an awesome trip out in the Mount Prindle area.